Good morning, everyone.
Good morning.
So, what we're going to do today is we're going to kind of do a history/thematic look through Genesis. It won't take as long as the last time we went through Genesis. Promise. I don't have the material for Lads to Leaders yet because the book hasn't been published. Also, Lads to Leaders is just finishing up their last stateside conventions for the year, so they haven't gotten to the material for next year yet. They're finishing up their conventions right now in Oklahoma City and Altoona, Pennsylvania. So, I've looked at the theme. Just a bit. I've looked at the theme, and I've kind of extrapolated where I think it can go, and we'll work with that here. So think of this as a bit of a history lesson. Think of it as a bit of a thematic idea. Yeah. So that's the plan. I'm going to start recording these and uploading them to the church's YouTube. That's why this is not full screen, because the way my broadcasting software works, if I full screen the thing, it's not actually going to advance for the people watching it later. So, but you can see that clear enough, right? Okay. Most of you, hopefully. I'll read what's on there anyways, but it's gonna be a bit text heavy, but we're gonna get through it also. All right. Before we get started, Keith, will you open us up in prayer, please?
Okay, Father in heaven, we come here again. We're thankful for hearing your word. We're thankful for being saved, not blessed being saved. Thank you again, Father, for many blessings of this life. Help us to take Stephen's lesson with us and show others about Jesus Christ. He is the way, and the only way, to life everlasting. We thank you, Father, so much for your Son, Jesus Christ. In his name we pray. Amen.
Amen. Thank you. Yes.
Let me just say this. This is a good thing, recording this and so on. On Wednesday nights, it's been an increasing audience of people outside the church that have been watching. We had a number of people here, and we had 89 people that watched the presentation and heard what we were doing here. It's a blessing to have this kind of technology available.
It is a blessing, yeah. So in case the mic didn't pick it up, Larry mentioned, because I don't know how well my mic's picking this up. I'll find this out later after this is all done. So just to reiterate, Larry said that we've had, 89 people I think were watching on Facebook on Wednesday night?
Yeah.
Yeah, and we had about 10 people here, so yeah, somewhere around there. Okay, so yeah, so now stay focused, Steve. Don't talk about engagement yet. Material. All right, so I gotta actually tell this to start moving around a bit now. So the theme for coming up is no other God. Now, the key verse to this is 1 Kings 8:23. That's what it said in the program, in the manual. I cannot find any translation that actually said the phrase no other God, just no God. I checked the New King James Version, the ESV, the New American Standard. I even checked the Message. And I checked the New Living Translation. I could not find the phrase no other God. I didn't check the word on the street because I couldn't find it on Bible Gateway. Yes, Larry?
Exodus chapter 20, verse 1 and 2 will work for that.
Exodus is 20, yes, yeah, so the first commandment. We'll talk about Exodus in a week or two. Yes. But the key verse from here is from 1 Kings 8:23. This is Solomon. He is dedicating the temple. It starts mid-sentence, hence those ellipses there at the beginning. O Lord God of Israel, there is no God like you in heaven above or on earth beneath, keeping covenant and showing steadfast love to your servants who walk before you with all their heart. And then it goes on there, hence the ellipses, into verse 24 and on. Now, looking at this verse is interesting to me because how much do we know of the gods and the religions of the people that would have been around during the time of King Solomon? Not much. So we're going to, once we get through this survey of the Old Testament up to how we get to Solomon and building the temple and dedicating it, and the unfortunate decisions he makes and a whole bunch of people make afterwards, we might spend some time looking at the gods of the times around them. I mean, we've spent some times probably off on talking about some of the gods of Egypt and things like that, but I don't think we appreciate just how unique God is. And we're going to start looking at that here throughout this study, beginning with Genesis. A lot of people, when they talk about Genesis, they kind of want to go right to the fall of man because we are selfish, we are sinful, and why not start with us? But we're not going to do that. We'll start with Genesis 1 and 2 briefly. A lot of what I'm talking about today comes from three sources. The Epic of Eden by Dr. Sandra Richter, the Bema Discipleship Podcast, mainly the first session of it, which looks through Genesis through Deuteronomy, and then Ephraim Avenor Spicer's commentary on the book of Genesis. Do I agree with everything these people have said and written? No. You can fight Marty Solomon of the Baymaw podcast if you want. You can fight with Dr. Richter about it. Spicer died as soon as his commentary was published, so you'd have to talk to his grave, I guess. So again, some of what I might be talking about has come from, I've learned and extrapolated from these sources. Because again, the Bible, we are not the initial receivers of the Old Testament. That would have been the Israelites, the Jews. So what they could understand from what they took from it was sometimes different than what we might do. So again, the Bible is written for us, but not necessarily to us. Did I get that phrase right? Okay, good. So if I got it the other way around, it wouldn't be so good. So I grabbed this from the Genesis thing from last year. Genesis is divided into four major sections. Essentially, there's prehistory. That's Genesis 1, so creation through the Tower of Babel. Well, almost the end of chapter 11, because Abraham's actually introduced at the end of 11. But we call it prehistory because we can't really date things exactly. We can't date things very well between that through a lot of that time period. I don't remember where this definitely came from, the Epic of Eden book. There was some bishop or pope somewhere that did some math and said the world began on October 4th, such and such year BC. He had it down to the day. I don't remember exactly what it was. But for the Israelites that would have received, that Moses would have told the Genesis account to, it didn't matter when. It mattered who and what. And we'll talk about that. So Genesis 12 through part of chapter 25 was about Abraham. Then Jacob is the next major section. That's the rest of 25 with a little bit of Isaac sprinkled in there. Through 37, technically the first verse of 37. And then Joseph's the rest of chapter 37 through 50. Essentially, if you want to kind of follow along kind of what's going on here. So what we want to look at here is how God is unique and how he's different and how things are different. And again, it will help later on, and we should have done the studies of other things beforehand. I realized that this morning after I put this together last night. So we might move things around here a bit. But anyway, so creation to departure, Genesis 1 through 11. So chapters 1 and 2 is creation. Chapter 1, when God set about to create the world, etc., Genesis 1:1. So anyone know how the books in the Hebrew Bible were originally named, or how they're named? By the first words of the book. Like how we have a lot of songs, like someone would say, oh, well, sing Count Your Blessings. Well, I can't find it as Count Your Blessings, but if I look up One Upon Life's Billows, there you go. So yeah, so for the Hebrews, Genesis, it wouldn't have been called the book of Genesis. It would have been called Bereshit bara. My Hebrew is awful. I'm going to stop from there because I don't know the rest of the phrase. But, when God set, when in the beginning, or when God set forth to, the book of Exodus would be called, these are the names, something like that. Leviticus would have been called, and he called, very, very different. But anyway, so Genesis 1 looks at the creation, essentially, 6 days, time periods, 6 sets of time, however you want to look at them. And it's all good. Then he makes us, and it is very good. And then chapter 2 tells us that, and then he rests. And that goes and then we get a slight recounting, focusing more on more looking in depth with man. And here's where things really started getting interesting, because historically, most, and I'm not going to say this about all pagan gods, but typically your creation stories are, there is a god and he was sad, or he was upset and he cried and his teardrops fell and they became people, or or there was a god and he accidentally knocked over a bowl of something and out came clay, and out of that formed people, and the gods weren't happy, and gods were stuck with all these people all of a sudden. It was not, we came by accident. If you want to think of it this way, what does biological evolution tell us? We were an accident. The planet was an accident. The universe was an accident. The amoeba that became the whatever, that became the fish, that became the crocodile, that grew wings and became a chicken, that became the ape. I skipped a few steps in here. That became us, was all an accident. God is intentional in his design. If you notice, he was intentional when he was setting apart the waters from above and below. He was intentional when he made the creatures. He was intentional when he made us. He was intentional when he looked, you know what? It's not good for man to be alone. He needs a help. He needs a companion. He needs a helpmeet. He needs a someone to. I'm trying to think of. There's a phrase. Essentially, so think of having two pieces of wood, and you want to have them this way. One can't stand on its own, right? So you need the other to stand against you. Now, when it says stand against, it doesn't mean to, stand against you in an oppositional sense, but more as a support, and both support each other. So God's intentional, because God's like, you know what? I've got the angels. I've got all these things. It's not, I'm not alone. God also is God, but, he has spirits there and, pre-incarnate Jesus. But he also says, man, it's not good for him to be alone, because, everyone else has something or someone. So God says, okay, Eve. So instead of saying, okay, well, I made people, oops, God says, I'm going to make more people, in other words, because I don't want one to be alone. And also then we find here in chapter 2 and some of verse 3, what does God do on occasion in the garden? He walks in the garden. Now, if we look at Greek mythology, gods came down to earth all the time. Now, remember, though, the Greek gods were not the original. It wasn't like Zeus. It's not like there was Zeus and then there was the world. No, Zeus had to be born and stuff, and essentially by the Titans, who were essentially, creatures that I don't know if anyone ever really figured out where the Titans supposedly came from. I haven't looked that deep into it, but yes, the Titans came from Tennessee. Formerly, before that they were, finding oil in Houston, and yeah. No, but yeah, so Greek mythology, it's not a case of here's a bunch of gods and they make the world. No, the world already exists, but people are terrified of these elemental and massive creatures, essentially. And Zeus, essentially, you can look up the story of Zeus and Kronos. It's, but yeah, so Zeus would come down and wreak havoc. That's how we get the Minotaur. A lot of the other gods would do that, pretty much thwart each other and use us as pawns in the situation. So, again, the Egyptians, their gods were not kind and benevolent. We'll talk about those a bit here, and I know Terry talked on them years ago when he went through spent some time with the plagues and things like that. So we'll revise that. But again, so God is walking with his people because he wants to, not to wreak havoc, but he wants to spend time with them. He wants relationship. Keith mentioned his prayer about knowing Jesus. The whole purpose that God made us was so we could know him, so we could, so when he could be our Heavenly Father, but too so we can know him, so we could be in communion with him and things like that. Are we made to worship him? Absolutely, but we're also made to know him as well. And that's what sets us apart. Now, that's what set the Israelites apart as well. That's what sets the Israelites apart too. Now, with the law, it might not look like that. And we'll talk about that when we get to Leviticus, but the intention was always for God to be among his people. Now, chapter 3 comes about, we have a walking snake. At no point does Eve go, why is the snake walking and talking? It's just like, oh, hi snake. Oh, Yeah, and the serpent lies to her, and he tells her that you're missing something, and that's what Satan does. He's like, you're missing something, because who was Adam and Eve made in? What were they made in? The image of God. What does Satan tell them that they are lacking? They're lacking knowledge. But if you're made in the knowledge of good and evil, but if you're made in the image of God, therefore you have the knowledge of good and evil. And again, Satan says, you won't die. And he's right and he's wrong. Because did they die? Not physically, but they died spiritually. And God, when he said, you will die, did not, it said, from the day you eat it, you will die. And again, they were dead spiritually as soon as they ate it. Yeah. But maybe they didn't understand that. I don't know. We are reaping the consequences of that, and always have been. So anyway, so Adam and Eve are removed from the garden, and then the garden lifts up like a rocket into heaven. That's what I read in some fictional book somewhere. I don't know. We don't know what happened to the garden. It might have perished in the flood. It might be in heaven. It doesn't matter. There's discussion too about where the garden is supposed to be. I know some people have requested maps. I'll start working with maps here in a bit later on, just not today, because I need to find some good ones. It's hard finding maps that are easy to explain from Old Testament times without requiring a pointer or a bunch of highlighting, so I need to make some. But essentially, if it helps, just think of a lot of what's going on as having Israel here, the Israelites about here, and you're going to have Egypt over here, and then you're going to have another nation or two over here, and there's going to be this like kind of this circle going back around and around and around. So chapter 4 takes us to Cain and Abel. Yes, Terry?
Yeah, Stephen, I was going to say, you're touching on something here that's really important for our generation, but for the younger ones especially. Jeannie asked me, I don't know what she was reading the other day, but she wanted to explore the word caprice.
Okay.
Not the kind of shorts that when you talk about capriciousness, to say that our God is not capricious, that's almost that's the way the old timers in classical theology talked about it, was the lack of capriciousness on the part of our God. And that's a concept that's really kind of hard to wrap your head around if you think about it, but it points to the intentionality of God, is the term I think that you used. God, and when we try to think, well, he's God, he can just do anything he wants for no reason, just because he wants to. Whimsical, but not necessarily in a lighthearted way, that he just didn't create on a whim. But that's not part of his nature. He's not that way. Not that he couldn't be that way, but he's very without capriciousness. He's not going to fly off the handle and do something radical just because he can. And I think that's hard to grasp on the part of people in general, but maybe young people in particular, because somebody wrote a book called Making God in Our Own Image. And we tend to take our own selves and bump it up many notches and say, okay, now, if I were God, and sometimes we really like to be capricious, not in a necessarily evil kind of way, but so we project that on God, and we say, well, he's got to be that way, but he's not. And so I'm blabbering here to say that we really do, it is helpful to rethink what Jehovah God really is.
Yes. Yeah.
And not to accuse him of being capricious or whatever term you want to use for it, just because because we might be that way if we were all.
And I'll get you in a moment, Mom. Yeah. So this reminded me, Terry. So this is totally coming from the Bema podcast. One of the translations of El Shaddai, which God says later on, you have known me as some have known me as El Shaddai, or I've been called that, translates to the God who knows when to say enough. Note, God could have kept working after that 6 days, but he said, nope, enough. We'll look at the flood. God could have kept the flood going for a longer time and destroying even more, but he said, enough. God could have kept Jesus in the tomb for more than 3 days, but he said, enough. So that's what separates us from animals, because animals can reason. Animals can do a lot of the same things we can. They cannot say enough. How many of your dogs will eat until there's no food left instead of saying, I'm going to save some of this for later? Yeah. If it's mating season and there's deers out there and the deers want to mate, they're going to mate. They're not going to say, let me check my calendar and see if this is a good time or not. No, they don't know when to say enough. We do. Adam and Eve failed in that. We fail in that. God does not. Mom?
Over the years, I'm sure everybody's heard this, God, why does God allow this, why does God allow that, And it's like, it's people that are doing it. It's not God. God doesn't, doesn't really allow things. Lets people think on their own. But it's not really God's fault. Somebody does something, it's their fault, not God's.
Maybe more, why does he allow these things to happen? Might be a better way, which we'll talk about that in a bit, because we're going to get to, I'm going to shoehorn in something here that I forgot to put in the notes earlier, but we'll get there. So Cain and Abel. So you have Cain, and Cain kills Abel because he is angry. And God tells him, again, God says, hey, wait, take a minute here. Don't walk out of the house yet. Calm down. I still love you. You can do better. But Cain just walks out there and kills his brother, and God says, okay, you can't be a gardener anymore. I need you to wander. So he wanders. So Cain wanders until he stops wandering and builds a city. The disobedience continues. Then we get Cain's genealogy for the remainder of chapter 4, which leads to more violence and more death by the end. Chapter 5 is Adam's genealogy through Seth, and that's essentially that. And that's when we get these people living for a very, 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 very long time, including Methuselah, who gives birth to, I forget Noah's father's name, who then gives birth to Noah. 400, 500 years pass, and it's time for the flood. Now, the flood is interesting because there are a ton of flood accounts from that region. Between the Noah story, the Epic of Gilgamesh, there's a lot of things. Secular teachers will say, well, if there's so many stories, that means it didn't happen. I think it's the reverse. If there's so many accounts of one thing happening, it must have happened. Now, what we have in Genesis 6 through 8 is kind of confusing sometimes, because it looks like it's multiple pieces that have been pieced together from different accounts. That doesn't matter. The important thing is that God says, okay, we need to clean things up, but I'm not getting rid of everyone. In the Epic of Gilgamesh, which was Sumerian literature, I believe, not Sumerian, Sumerian. Sumer is way before Samaria. Essentially, the gods are like, the people are too noisy, we cannot sleep, so we're going to kill them all. Except one of the gods goes to I'm not going to try to say his name, it's like 5 or 6 syllables, Upnastapishtim, something like that, and tells him, hey, build a raft or something so you can live. And I don't remember if the animals are there, but so there is some divine intervention there, but it's not as good as what we have with Noah. So there's the flood. Noah and his family are told to be fruitful and multiply. So Noah's got 3 kids. They can be fruitful and multiply. Noah's probably supposed to have more kids. We won't talk about what happens to Noah in that tent. That is a completely different discussion. At least there's no kids present, so we could talk about it. But it's very, very interesting when you dig into the Hebrew. But the more important thing right there here in chapter 9, before that whole tent situation happens, is God's covenant with Noah. So covenants. All right, married people. You made vows when you got married, right? if you had a traditional Christian wedding ceremony, we don't really have anything the Bible tells us what we're supposed to do in our wedding ceremony. So, but you made vows to each other, right? Yeah, you made a covenant. You made a people, those of you that have jobs, including, those with jobs, we signed a contract, right? That says if you do this, you will receive, the employer tells the employee, if the employee does this, the employer will do this. If the employee does that, the employer can do this. So, this is nothing. So we're familiar with the idea of covenants and stuff via contracts and marriage vows, things like that. Now, there's also the suzerain vassal covenant. We'll talk about that later on. We're not at that point yet. But God's going to make this covenant with Noah and says, okay, people are always going to be evil. But I cannot in good conscience destroy the world as I just did with the flood. Now, what you do with a covenant is, okay, so how many of you still have your contracts that you have a copy of your contract that you signed for your job? I still have mine. I still have my initial contract that I signed, or at least a form of it from when I first started teaching. I keep it up just because for me it was a big deal getting that, even if it wasn't the ideal situation. How many of you remember what your wedding vows were? Okay. How many of you, you can easily look up those online unless you had non-traditional ones. But the idea is that both parties are supposed to keep a copy of what this agreement was. Now, obviously, and generally the person that was in power would be the one that would say, hey, that the person that was not in power is supposed to present that sign or whatever it is to the person in power, so they go, oh yeah, I did make that agreement with you, I will honor it. God is different. God says, well, I'm not going to ask you to carry around something to remind you about that I won't destroy the world. I'm going to give you a rainbow, or a bow as it goes right in the Hebrew. There's several hymns about rainbows and things like that. We don't sing any of them, I don't think, too much, aside from blue skies and rainbows. But anyways, think of the bow. Which way is the bow pointing? If it's like this, and think of it like a bow, not just a rainbow. It pointing up. So typically, that whole part about if I fail to keep this covenant part, or I fail to keep this promise, or I fail to do my job, God's pointing the arrow at himself, not at us. So God is essentially saying, I am taking full responsibility for this. He will not destroy the world via flood. Now, I'm sure we could find our own way to destroy this planet via flood if we really put our minds to it. We could find a way to do pretty much anything good or bad. But God himself is like, I'm not going to destroy the world by flood again. Some ways you can look at it and say, I'm not going to destroy the world again. Or at least the people on it. Again, do we have the capability of destroying this planet? Yes. Unfortunately. But, so God gives a covenant there with Noah, essentially saying, okay, the flood on that scale not going to happen. Whether it was from north to south pole and all around the globe, or it was just a very big localized flood, we don't know. But there was something. We know the ark landed in Kentucky. That's all we know. So Abraham was pretty far out, and then he had to go from, that's not the real one there. I'm pretty sure Noah took the original ark and used it for firewood or something else. So that's me. So chapter 10, we get the genealogy of Noah's sons. This is interesting because one of the sons essentially, when Noah is harmed by one of his sons, he doesn't curse his son, he curses his grandson. So we kind of get this idea of, okay, well, where did all these nations come from? And this kind of tells us, including Egypt and some others. And I want to say it's probably around this time period when Job happens. Because Job is an earlier written piece, and that's fine. But we don't know, and we don't know exactly when in the Old Testament it takes place, but if we look by how old Job is when he dies, this is probably about the best time period. Because God has set a statute at this point of 120 years, and it's not going to be until Moses where that completely seems to hit. So Job is probably happening around this time era, I'd say, based on how long he lives. Though we don't really know how old he is when his troubles begin. And this is when it comes back to, why does God allow bad things to happen? In this case, it's because Satan Satan could walk around heaven, and he was already cast out from there. So Satan, really is cast out. He lost his job, and he lost his position, at least we could say. So Satan's, God's saying, God's, look at Job. He won't curse me. And Satan's like, well, we'll see about that. And they saw about that. Job did everything but curse God. Incidentally, we always get on Job's wife about telling him, to curse God and die. If you look closely enough later on, Job actually says a good thing or two about his wife. So apparently, I don't remember where it was. I actually went through the book of Job yesterday, but at some point he mentions his wife. I'm like, oh, that's interesting. So apparently, unless he remarried in the midst of his trouble, they were still together. And of course, he had to be together with someone because he has more kids afterwards. So, but anyway, so.
Even before you leave this, I just want to take this opportunity to talk a little fulfilled eschatology, because this flood thing, the destruction of the world by the flood, we totally miss God's declaration at the end of it. He says he'll never do this again. But our brethren, and some of us even maybe now, still say, oh no, he'll never, they emphasize he'll never destroy the world by water. But next time he's going to do it by a fire. The reasoning behind that is ridiculous. Why would God say, I'm never going to do this again? And God didn't say, I'm never going to do this again. This time it was by water, next time I'll do it by fire. God is saying, this doesn't work just to have a flood. So I'm going to change the whole world. I'm going to change the covenant and make it through the means of Jesus, where you can come back into my presence. And it's really sad that we miss the whole point of not only the flood, but the rainbow.
Yeah.
The rainbow is essentially a promise. There's not going to be eschatology anymore.
Yeah.
Because you're going to be in a new world.
Yes.
Anyway.
Yeah. And
we have really messed up.
And I think we get the fire thing from Peter a lot. The elements will melt with fervent heat and things like that. But God says, as long as the seasons are around and things like that, as long as the earth remains, won't destroy it. I will not destroy every living creature as I have just done. Because again, God knows when to say enough. And I think the reason for the flood, for the timing of it, really had to do with, one, the wickedness of man, but two, there was, I think, a lot of things on the earth that that God did not want here anymore, that were enticing men and women. It could have been some form of demons or things like that, some of the giants, things he had not things that he had not either created and had got twisted, or that Satan himself had found a way to bring about. That's my opinion. So Genesis 10, we get the genealogy of Noah's sons, and they mention Nimrod. Nimrod was a mighty man before the Lord. He was a mighty hunter before the Lord. He was a man who did not like God, in other words. So this, and if you wonder why, he also has is also, his name is very, is not used very nicely. You don't call anyone a Nimrod out of, respect. But anyway, it actually, Nimrod might be a better way of pronouncing it, to be honest, might be more close to it. But anyways, we get the Tower of Babel in Genesis 11. Which Nimrod might have been in charge of, because he was a king, and he might have been, I want to reach the heavens and be God. And that's really where a lot of this whole thing comes about. If the people put work together, they can do anything. And again, did God tell them to settle in the plains of Shinar? Probably not. God's trying to keep his people away from what's going to become Babylon. He's trying to keep them out from what's going to be Egypt. There will be times for them to go there, but he wants his people in a specific area, and they keep wandering. Now, they have to do some wandering because, for the most part, they're nomads. They go where the grass is for their sheep and things like that. They're shepherds, they're nomads, but he's saying, I don't want you in the cities yet. He has no problem with the people in Shinar going, oh, we figured out how to make bricks and do things. He has a problem with what they plan on doing with it. So I know we're out of time here. I'll quickly wrap this up. At the end of chapter 11, we read about Terah, Nahor, Abraham, and Haran. And this is really interesting because Abram's listed first. If you look at how this works genealogically, Abram cannot be the firstborn because Abram and his brother are going to marry their nieces. And there's a 10-year gap between Abram and Sarai. And essentially, there has to definitely be a different time so Abram has to probably be the second or third born, probably the second born out of the 3 sons, but he gets precedence because of how important he is genealogically for the Israelites and for the Hebrews and the Jews. So anyways, his father's like, we need to leave Mesopotamia, we need to leave the Chaldees. Hammurabi is not for some reason living under Hammurabi and his code is not working for us. So they do that. We don't know why. And then out of the midst of this, God's going to go to Abram and at the beginning of chapter 12 and say, leave your family. I know that's weird because your older brother's dead. You're in charge. Your father's dead. You're in charge now. Leave. And he's going to do that, and we're going to see where that journey of faith takes him next week through this brief survey of the Old Testament up through 1 Kings. Thank you all.